Hi, it's Penny here, and today we're going to be talking about some of the best fantasy books that I've read in 2021. So a couple of weeks ago, I talked about some of the best fantasy books that I read. This time we're going to do the science fiction ones. And this definitely includes some of my favorite books of the year. I was really loving science fiction in 2021, and hopefully I can keep up with reading more of it in 2022. I don't think I've done a good job of that so far, but it's something to remind myself about. So I've got 10 books here, and again, I've kind of tried to put them in the order from least best to most best, but I don't know if that ordering would stand up to scrutiny. It's a vague ordering. So we're going to start with number 10, and that is going to be The Martian by Andy Weir. This is a really popular book, very hyped, and so I was a little bit wary going into it. I wasn't sure if it was going to be for me. However, I had already seen the movie and really enjoyed the movie, so I guess I shouldn't have been surprised that I liked it, but I do think the movie is a very true adaptation of this, so if you liked the movie, you'll probably like the book. I also thought, having seen the movie, that I would be slightly bored in this because I would know exactly what was going to happen. But for starters, it doesn't exactly follow the movie. But also, I just really liked following along on Mark Watney's problem-solving journey, as he's basically left for dead on Mars and has to figure out how to survive for a very long time on a very inhospitable planet. But he does so with a lot of humour. We also get bits of what's happening on Earth as they discover that he's alive and try to come to his rescue. And I read this very quickly because even though I knew what was going to happen in the end, I just felt like I always needed to know what was going to happen next. So it's a lot of fun. There's a lot of science in it, but I do feel like it's presented in a very digestible way. And given how popular this book has been, I guess that must be true because most people seem to have enjoyed it. The only downside I would say is there are a few jokes in it that are slightly questionable from like a feminist point of view. But it's a couple of jokes in a book that's mostly pretty good. So we'll let it slide. So next on my list is Forest of Memory by Mary Robinette Kowal. This is just a short novella set in a world where every single thing that you do is recorded. You can share certain experiences and memories with other people on the internet. And you can also pretty much have anything created for you. Our main character, however, is an authenticity stealer. So some people like to have authentic, real things, and so she'll track these things down for them, or like find cool things and find a buyer for them. And the story's told in a really interesting way. So our main character is typing the story on this typewriter, telling the story about what happened to her after she bought the typewriter, and then through a series of events her memory was not recorded for several days. So it's got some typos because she's not perfect at typing, which I really enjoyed the authenticity of that. And I don't want to give away too much about what happens while she's been kidnapped, but there's a lot in the story about, I guess, what makes experiences real and how things might change if you were always in contact with the internet. Although I think the main thing that I liked was just Mary Robinette Kowal's writing style. I really enjoy it, and I want to say this was a lovely story, but at the same time, some quite awful things do happen while she's disconnected, so maybe that's not entirely accurate. Then we've got The Passengers by John Marrs. So in this story, we've got 10 self-driving cars, and they have all been set up to collide. And this secret court that resides over crashes that have happened with self-driving cars is basically forced to decide which one of these self-driving cars is going to survive, and the whole decision process is being broadcast on the internet. So basically these hackers have set this up, kind of trying to expose some of the dodgy dealings with this secret court. And that part of the story was interesting, but the main part of the story is we're getting the story of each of these people in these self-driving cars, and the way their stories are presented is in such a way that you keep flipping as to whether they're good people or not. Are the things that they've done good, or are they justifiable? And it's really questioning people's abilities to make judgments about others when they might not have the full information. So it's quite action-paced, but also just like a really interesting analysis of society and how we make judgments on others. And it also had some interesting things to say about self-driving cars and the way we legislate them, I guess. This is more of a sci-fi thriller, so it was also quite thrilling. And I really enjoyed it. I'm going to say I really enjoyed all of these. Just Just ignore me. Then we've got Remote Control by Nnedi Okorafor, and I'll be honest, most people describe this as being a story about the goddaughter of death. And I feel like that pitch is not entirely accurate. Primarily, we're following this young girl who finds this artifact and as a result gains certain abilities. These abilities are not always positive, and she's struggling with how to use them and how to live her life, while also trying to investigate the events that happened when she gained these powers. A lot of people do come to fear her, and they call her the goddaughter of death. But like, when you hear that she is the goddaughter of death, you think that death is going to be a character in the story, and maybe metaphorically, not in actuality. But despite all the science fiction stuff going on in this story, I also think to a large degree it's just a magical coming of age story where this girl is trying to find her place in the world. There's some really magical elements, even though at its core I would say it's science fiction, but it's almost written in a very fantastical way. And I just came to love this girl so much, and I loved following along with her journey. The only thing I will say is I read this physically and I gave it 5 stars, and then because I loved it so much, I decided to pick up the audiobook and reread it that way, and I hated the audiobook. I think if I'd read the audiobook first, I would have only given it 2 stars. And I don't think that the audiobook narrator necessarily did a terrible job. It's just that their reading didn't match my experience of reading the book. So that was strange, but I would personally recommend reading it physically, not listening to the audiobook. Okay, now we're up to the part of the list where I'm definitely questioning the order that I previously chose, but let's just go with the order that I selected. So next we've got The Echo Wife by Sarah Gailey. So this book follows the woman who basically invented cloning, but unfortunately for her, her husband, being kind of an asshole, left her for a clone of her, which she's not entirely happy about, and then her clone turns up asking for help because something's gone wrong. I really love this story. It does get kind of dark in some parts, but at the same time, for the most part, this is more of a character study. It's really looking at some of the things that happened in this woman's childhood that were quite formative, and how those things have affected her into her adulthood, and then kind of comparing and contrasting how her clone might be different, having not actually gone through those things. So even though I liked the whole story with the clones and the direction that went in, I think actually what made me like the story the most was just getting to know this woman and relating to some of the struggles that she was going through. I've read a few things by Sarah Gailey before, and I do think that I really like their writing style. So I think if you've liked other Sarah Gailey things, you'll probably like this as well. I want to say I found this a lot of fun, but there's a whole bunch of murder and clone bodies being purposely damaged so that they'll be scarred in the same way as the originals, and it's not always nice, but still, I found it a lot of fun. Then we've got the original by Brandon Sanderson and Mary Robinette Kowal. So Mary Robinette Kowal's on the list twice. I think this is a story where it was Brandon Sanderson's idea, but Mary Robinette Kowal did most of the writing, which I always find really interesting because a long time ago, Patrick Rothfuss did this thing where he set up 5 Twitter accounts and then got different people to be fake Patrick Rothfusses for a month. And there was this whole challenge where you had to try and guess which one was the real Patrick Rothfuss. And at the end of it, I thought that it came down to 2 possibilities. And the one that most people voted for was the one that was being managed by Mary Robinette Kowal. And I read a thing about how she faked Patrick Rothfuss's writing style in the tweets. And I thought it was really brilliant. I guessed it correctly though. I thought the one that was her seemed pretty close, but there were a few things that made me think it was the other one. So I won. Anyway, it does make me wonder if Mary Robinette Kowal used some of those same techniques to try and duplicate Brandon Sanderson's writing style, because I do think it still felt like it was a Sanderson piece of work, and I'm sure they worked together, but I do think Mary Robinette Kowal is probably a pretty good co-writer when you've got lots of ideas and not enough time to write them, which is definitely Brandon Sanderson's problem. So in this one, it's another one with cloning, but in this one, a woman wakes up and is told, you're the clone of your original self, and actually your original self has murdered your husband. So we're going to keep you alive for a short period of time, and if in that time you can find your original self, then you will get to become the new you, and we'll get rid of that original you that is a criminal and a murderer. So she has no memory of actually murdering her husband. She doesn't know why she would have done that, and she goes about trying to investigate what's happened. Also, a really interesting element in this world is that people can change their perceptions. So they put on different skins and you can see everything as being really beautiful, or like, I think the example is you could make everything Western style. But this clone doesn't have any of that skinning, and so in a lot of ways she's seeing a lot of things for the first time. She goes somewhere that she used to really love during this experience and discovers that it was nothing like what she thought. I know she eats oranges, I think, and remembers that she'd actually changed the taste of oranges for herself in the past, and so they don't taste like what she thought either. And it was really interesting to think about the way that we could change things, both for good and for bad, if this was a real thing. As well, the murder mystery was a lot of fun. There was some cool action. I don't think that the actual plot was quite as good as just the general concept in the world. And this one was also a novella, so I feel like we didn't get to learn and explore the world as much as I would have liked. And I'm really hopeful that one day we would get some more things in this world, because I feel like there's a lot of potential. Okay, then we've got Exhalation by Ted Chiang. Now, I think the previous year I read Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang. Both of these are short story anthologies, and I just really love his short stories. I think he comes up with really interesting concepts and really looks at different philosophical ideas in a really interesting way. And the way that he writes is that he makes it feel like it's a real world story, and this is just someone telling a story about what really happened. So the way the world building is done, even though these worlds are often completely different from our own, the way the world building is done just feels so real to me. I love his writing style. A significant piece of this particular book is this story about these developers of these virtual pets. Initially, these pets are really amazing technology and doing way more than anyone could ever think they would do, and then eventually they become more obsolete. And I think the story was called The Life Cycle of Software Objects. It was really interesting to think about. This is the life cycle of software, that in the beginning it's really amazing and then eventually it becomes obsolete. But if we're talking about virtual pets that are pretty much sentient, then how does that work? Also, what happens when humans become obsolete? Let's not get too dark. But I really liked these stories. I just love Ted Chiang's writing, and I keep all the time looking up on Google about when he's going to write some more, because I want more of his thoughts and more of his really amazing stories. Okay, now we're up to the top 3. I think these are definitely the top 3. The order might change, but these were definitely my favorite science fictions. So, firstly, we've got Amatka by Karen Tidbeck. This is such a strange story. We've got this woman who is a hygiene product researcher, but we're also in this dystopian world where there's different colonies. And so she's traveling from one colony to another to find out about their hygiene needs. Except she's also really struggling with grief for some awful things that have happened with her. And as a result, sometimes she forgets to name things. And in this world, if you don't regularly name things, then they can lose their form and turn into mush. And they don't really know how they got to this world, why things are like this. There are these councils that are like the government that are definitely keeping a lot of secrets. They will just say, we're not going to talk about this thing anymore, and then people are not allowed to talk about it anymore. And through her researching about hygiene products, she starts to learn about some of these secrets and starts kind of really having her eyes opened about this society. And then things just get weirder and weirder, and I loved it. It was so surreal, but also very personal. Like the way the story was told, it really was looking at the effects of this world on the people. And there were some parts that just made me feel so emotional, and I really want to reread this story. I really loved it. Then the next 2, you can tell I love them because I actually own them. I don't necessarily own a lot of books because I often get them from the library, although Amatka is on my list of ones I would like to obtain. But number 2 on my top sci-fi list is the first short story from this The Inheritance short story anthology. So it's by Robin Hobb and Megan Lindholm, although Megan Lindholm is actually just a pen name for Robin Hobb. But with Megan Lindholm, she writes I want to say more science fiction, but also probably just more speculative fiction, different from how Robin Hobb's stuff is mostly like epic fantasies. But the first short story from this was amazing. I absolutely loved it. I actually listened to it on audiobook despite owning the physical book, and I thought the narration style was amazing. It's another one of these ones where the world building is done in such a way that you feel like you're actually just being told a real story. So we've got this young boy, and his mother and him live in poverty. His mother is really obsessed with music, and she gets them in a lot of trouble by always hanging on to these different musicians who a lot of them are kind of losers and take advantage of her. But also there are these aliens that have arrived. They're kind of exiles from their own planet, and they have these membranes that allow them to basically reproduce any sound, but they also have this religious belief that they're not allowed to create music. So they spend a lot of time reproducing music. Even when they speak, they're more just reproducing human sounds. And this mother ends up having a relationship with one of these aliens, and of course the son has a relationship with this alien as well. And I just thought the story was so beautiful. And just thinking about it now, I want to reread this one as well. Oh, making these videos is going to lead to me doing a lot of rereading. It's just a beautiful story about these poor alien creatures who don't really have a place in the world. The way that Robin Hobb talks about poverty, I thought was very moving and emotional and both genuine and human. I was just looking in the book because I couldn't even remember the name of the story, but it's called A Touch of Lavender. And I'm remembering now that the alien's name was Lavender. I'm also remembering that the story went in a really strange direction, but the whole time it just felt very emotional. I guess this is Robin Hobb's style, is that she builds these very realistic characters and then makes them go through difficult things. But the ideas were so amazing. I loved it. I've only picked out that one story because this is a mix of fantasy and science fiction. Mostly fantasy or more speculative stuff rather than sci-fi. And as well, I definitely think that was the strongest story from this whole book. Then lastly, we've got my favorite book of the year. This one I read quite near the end of the year, so I don't feel like maybe I need to reread it quite yet, but maybe soon. So the one I'm talking about is A Psalm for the Wild-Built by Becky Chambers. This is just a really beautiful story. I think primarily about figuring out what you want to do with your life. It's also a really hopeful story. In this one, again, it's written like it's real, and we're just being told a story about what actually happened. Basically, robots gained sentience and they decided they didn't really want to stay around. They decided to just go and live in the forest. And so the humans let all the robots go and live in the forest, and now they live without a lot of technology, just kind of more at peace with nature. And so just that idea to begin with was lovely. As well, we're following this person who decides to go and become a tea monk, who basically travels around and listens to different people's problems and gives them tea. And when this tea monk is out in the wilderness, they come across this robot. And the robot has basically been sent as a representative of the robots just to check in on the humans and find out what it is that they want. And learning about the robots from this robot as these two just talk to each other and philosophize. I just thought it was really beautiful. I think as well, for me, I've been in a work situation that's been very stressful, and a lot of the story... Excuse me, birds. Sorry about the birds. Nature, you know, gotta live at peace with it. So I think this book for me, I've been very stressed at work, and I've now finished my job, and I'm thinking about what would make me happier, what kind of life I want to have, which is a very similar journey to what this tea monk is going on. So I think I read this book at the perfect time for me, but I also just really loved the hopeful tone, and the writing style is really beautiful. I loved meeting the robot and getting to learn a little bit about how robots might think, and it was just a really beautiful story. There's a second book coming out this year, and I'm super excited about it. I think it's probably my most anticipated read of 2022. So, those are my favorite fantasy books that I read last year. Do let me know if you have read any of them, because I would love to talk with you about them down in the comments. Or also let me know if you're interested in reading any of them, or if you have any recommendations for science fiction books that are similar to any of these, because I would love to pick those up for sure. Otherwise, I hope that you are doing well, and I will see you next time.